terima kasih atas kehadiran Profesor Ashok Das dari University of Hawaii. And then we would like to thanks Professor Dr. Suyato for the attendees in this session as the head of Civic Education and Law Department, which memayungi prodi ilmu politik dan ilmu hukum in Yogyakarta State University. Before we continue to Professor Ashok's explanation on his research on cities in Indonesia, in Surabaya especially, we may mempersilahkan Mr. Professor Soto to deliver opening remarks for this session. To Profesor Suyato, dipersilahkan.
Oke, thank you, Mas Fikri. Terima kasih. Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, especially distinguished lecturer Prof. Ashok Das from Department of Urban and Regional Planning, University of Hawaii at Mānoa, College and participant. Good morning or good afternoon, Prof. Ashok, and welcome to this exciting webinar on governing cities in Indonesia. It is an honor to open this important discussion on such a crucial topic, which is central to development of our nation and democracy. As the head of civic education and law, Universitas Negeri Yogyakarta, I have the privilege of working along experts, policymakers, educators, and the next generation of leaders who are committed to advancing Indonesian civic life. To this topic, governing cities in Indonesia is of utmost relevance to our collective effort to ensure that cities, as the heartbeat of our nation, function not only as hub of economic growth, but also as spaces of inclusive governance, justice, and community engagement. In recent years, cities in Indonesia have seen rapid growth and transformation. With urbanization on the rise, the challenges of governance, social justice, sustainability, and the rule of law have never been more pressing. Effective governance is no longer just about managing infrastructure, but also about ensuring that citizens have access to basic service, fair representation, and opportunities for active participation in decision making. The role of politic science, especially civic education, has never been more critical in the shaping of citizenship, who will lead and influence urban governance. It is through civic education that we instill the values of democracy, justice, and shared responsibility, values that are essential in the managing of our cities. Through this education, we aim to equip our students, especially the youth, with the skill to engage in democratic processes, to understand the law, and to be active contributor in shaping a prosperous, equitable urban future. Today's seminar is an important platform for discussing the role of local government leaders, urban planner, and civic education practitioner in creating cities that work for everyone. As we go through today's session, I encourage all participants to think critically about how governance in cities can be more inclusive, how the voices of citizens can be heard, and how law and policies can be made to reflect the needs of diverse communities. Let us also remember that as we gather here today, we are part of a larger movement to ensure that Indonesian cities remain vibrant, sustainable, and governed by principles that prioritize the well-being of every citizen. regardless of their background or social economic status. I look forward to the inspiring ideas and solutions that will emerge from this gathering and trust that there will be a stepping stone toward advancing our shared commitment to democratic urban governance. Thank you once again for joining us today. I wish you all productive and insightful session. Let the webinar begin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Professor Dr. Suyato, for the opening remarks. May we go to the next agenda. Professor Ashok Das will present his dissemination on research on Surabaya cities and other cities in Indonesia. The we have we have still many times hour maybe or more. Then we will continue it to interactive discussion with our students and our attendees in this webinar. To Professor Ashok Das, may you give the presentation and dissemination. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Suyato, for the welcome remarks and also for your excellent remarks, which sets the backdrop for what I'm going to discuss. And I also wanted to thank Mas Reza and Mas Fikri and Mas Jen I just met. So thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me. It's really an honor to be, like sharing my research. So let me share my screen and then I'll talk you through. So I prepared, like Mas Reza had said, about 40 minutes, so it's around there, but feel free to let me know if I'll try to see the time, but in case I lose track of it, so let me know. I'll wind it up quicker if needed. So let me share my screen first. Okay. Yeah. Can you see my screen? Okay, good. So thank you. So within the so let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I am an architect and urban planner by training. And when I was doing my master's research thesis, which was at Kansas State University a long time back in the late 1990s, I studied affordable sort of self-help housing for my thesis. So I was in the architecture program back then. It was a research thesis I had to do. And so I studied a little bit about the Kampung Improvement Program in Indonesia. So then I went to do on my PhD program. And so when I was in my PhD program, I wanted to study. So this was in the early 2000s. And so decentralization had just happened in several, countries was happening. And Indonesia had just undergone the most extensive decentralization in human history. And eventually I ended up doing a comparative study for my dissertation, for my PhD dissertation, which was in urban planning at UCLA. And I studied post-decentralization projects, post-decentralization slum upgrading projects, comprehensive slum upgrading projects, and I will explain that a little bit as I present. So I was looking for projects which were conceived and sort of created locally, with local funding, with local resources. And so in both in India and Indonesia, decentralization had happened, and so local governments were becoming more autonomous and starting their own projects. So I chose two projects that I will talk about a little bit more. One was in Ahmedabad in India, and the other one was in Surabaya in Indonesia. So after my dissertation, I sort of really enjoyed my time doing dissertation work. This was during 2005, 2006. I spent about close to 5 months in Surabaya, and I came back and I really wanted to continue research. So from about 2009, I have been continuing to do research in Indonesia, particularly in East Java around Surabaya, but also more lately in Central Java. And over the years, a little bit in the Philippines and East Timor, and also in Thailand. So mainly in Southeast Asia, but also in recent years, also back in South Asia, including in India and Bangladesh. So that's a little bit of the background. And most of my work, so my dissertation research was about how does community participation lead to the empowerment of poor people, especially, and I was studying community empowerment through these slum upgrading projects, which I'll explain. So over the years, I've had the chance to study a lot of these local initiatives for kampung improvement and other kinds of projects for, let's say, addressing the problem of flooding, microfinance, urban agriculture, as well as disaster response, like what happened in Lapindo. So those kinds of things. So today I'm going to present to you my sort of shelter, housing related and services related work in Surabaya, and also try to show you the sort of importance in terms of local governance in a way. Anyway, so one of the main features of, so as you all know, the world is urbanizing very fast, and that's a good sign. Urbanization is good. It leads to more economic development, improves people's quality of life, but it also creates a lot of problems and challenges. Environmental challenges, challenges of equity and justice and inclusion. So this is a little problematic, given the rate at which the cities are changing. So this is an example of a classic example. This is not strange to you in Indonesia. You can look at Jakarta and many other cities where you see Jakarta particularly, or all the big cities in Southeast Asia, Manila, Bangkok, they have this problem where a lot of people continue to live in informal settlements. So this is Caracas, Venezuela, but this is a very stark image. It's a classic image where on the right-hand side, you can see formal development, and you can see much higher density and many more people living in informal settlements on the left-hand side. So this is another example. So I'm just showing you a few examples. So this is Brazil. But sometimes, the disparity in access to services and quality of life is so stark and shocking that it is almost sort of humiliating, when we think of planning and governance, that our inability to address the lives of so many people, the very sort of despicable quality of life that people have to endure. So this is São Paulo in Brazil, another city very, very famous or infamous for its favelas and slum settlements. But I show you that picture just to show you in the next picture. So that building that you see on the right-hand side inside the box is basically this building. So this just shows you the stark contrast that people's lives, demonstrate, right, in many cities around the world, in developing countries in the global south. So here, every apartment is one floor, and each apartment has a private swimming pool, and it overlooks, a squatter settlement, an informal settlement. So, this reality is not unique to São Paulo, but just an example, right? So anyway, so my challenge has been, so this is a cartoon that I made. I used to also be an illustrator for an architectural magazine in India in the past. So this was, and this is an illustration which just shows that it's very difficult. It's like a laboratory, a scientist trying to resolve, a housing problem, but it's very complicated. So we try all kinds of things. Some things work, some things don't work. So moving on. So like I said, so informality is a big, and most of you, I am presuming, are familiar with the concept of informality, right? So informality is basically anything which is different from what the formal is. So whatever the formal rules, regulations, plans, legal structures are, anything outside of that is informal. Now, most informality is clearly sort of associated or visible with poverty, right? So most people who work and live in the informal sector tend to be poor, but that's not always the case. So informality, I just wanted to make a point that informality is also very prevalent among other kinds of development. So seemingly formal developments that are for the rich and privileged can also be informal. So for example, if you violate any zoning laws or land use laws or height restrictions or building standards, then pretty much you are also committing an act which is informal, or you produce informality, but we generally don't associate informality with the rich and the privileged. So that's the point I wanted to make. However, it's true that most people, like this is just some graph that you can, statistics you can see that in Africa and in sort of Asia, in the cities, the vast majority of, in most cases, city populations actually exist in the informal sector. And by informal, mainly in terms of their employment, but also their housing and their shelter conditions. So these are some, issues about the issues about informality, which planning and governance need to improve. So one is just the legal standing. So informal, sector dwellers who say migrate from rural areas to cities are often not provided the same kinds of benefits and the same kinds of privileges as city dwellers do. So this is also a problem in Indonesia, where a lot of the government's welfare services, etc., are only available to people who can demonstrate that they are in the city with the KTP for the city, for example, right? So, but this exclusion is quite common. So China was infamous for having a hukou system. This kind of system also exists in India. In India, something called the ration card, which gives you access to public, food systems, subsidized food is also very restrictive. Education access is limited, healthcare access is limited, and so on and so forth. So anyway, so economic and social rights, access to core infrastructure services, social protections, these are the kinds of things. And a lot of these informal sector people live in informal settlements because they are home-based workers or they are street vendors, waste pickers, and you are all familiar with this. So most people who live in poor kampung in Indonesian cities are sort of in this category. So anyway, so what I'm going to talk about in this sort of presentation is quickly take you through how Surabaya has evolved, over several decades, almost taking you 50 years ago, maybe more than that. And I'm saying this because in sort of the global planning sort of literature, Surabaya actually occupies a very prominent place because it is considered to be one of the cities where the concept of slum upgrading or kampung improvement originated. And they have been very successful among even Indonesian cities, probably the most successful in sort of improving the lives of people who live in kampung and also protecting kampung. So I'll show you how that happened. But in recent years, there's been a transformation of this pro-poor approach. And this is because of changing institutional environments, changing and sort of certain entrenched institutional arrangements, meaning how local governments work with, let's say, other non-state actors, including civil society organizations and non-profit organizations. So my overall sort of message in this, you'll see, is that while there are reasons why sort of this transformation is inevitable, at the same time, it is kind of weakening the old pro-poor focus that Surabaya had, especially in relation to shelter and services, right? So before 1998, during the New Order period, is what I call the pre-decentralization phase, because this is exactly the phase when Surabaya did most of its sort of slum upgrading through the kampung improvement projects. Then there's a phase, approximately the first decade of post-decentralization, where again, there were some changes. And this is the period actually when I went to do my dissertation research, and this is the period when I studied. And then again, I'm calling it broadly sort of a neoliberal phase, which sort of corresponds more or less with the first two terms of Bu Risma as the mayor of Surabaya. All right. So what I'm saying is that in this period, neoliberalism or neoliberalist policies have kind of, again, this is my conception, this is my sort of reflection. So other people might disagree. It's a subjective matter. But I'm saying that there have been more neoliberal policies, more market-oriented, or reduction in government involvement in these kinds of services. And the consequence of that is that most of the current policies are less pro-poor than what Surabaya did in the first sort of actually in the New Order era, in a way, interestingly. Anyway, I won't go over this. So, so much of the work that I've done for sort of is kind of falls in this sort of theoretical framework between neoliberalism, decentralization, shelter for the poor, and also community participation, right? So anyway, so you all know this, so there's nothing to show here, but what is interesting is to show that how, these, just a second, let me just address my thing. Yeah, that the urban populations have been rising pretty much in all places, including the sort of the informal sector population in most places. So it's interesting that Jakarta and Surabaya are on the same island, but they're quite different, right? So one second, sorry. So because of urbanization, again, this is again familiar to all of you. So most of development and sort of economic development as well as spatial development has concentrated on Java, right? So this is nothing new for, students who study Indonesia, but it creates an issue. So this is why also probably that the cities on Java are probably a little more pressured in a way, right? So at the same time, they also have more resources and capacity post decentralization. Yet, I think, so there's more innovation also in these cities, but at the same time, the problems are also more pressing in on Java. So this is very interesting that, about 100 years ago, at the turn of the 20th century, Jakarta and Surabaya were approximately the same size. In fact, maybe Surabaya was, exactly the same size. But over the years, as you can see, the population sort of diverse quite a bit, right? So today, Jakarta represents what is called in urban geography terms, a primate city. So a primate city is something which is at least twice the size of the next largest city. So many of the big metropolises in Southeast Asia are primate cities. So Bangkok is a primate city. You could say Ho Chi Minh City is kind of like a primate city, I think. Manila for sure is a primate city like that. Whereas cities in China or India are not like primate cities because there's not that much of a difference in size. So the definition for a primate city is at least twice as big. So the consequence of that is that, then more resources as well as more sort of migration, etc., happens to the primate city. That is why Jakarta dominates sort of in the planning, policy, in research sort of, arenas in general. Both, when Indonesian scholars study it as well as definitely when foreign scholars study it, they mostly look at Jakarta. Anyway, so, but the problem of urbanization, because I showed you this graph, right? So as, so by the 1930s, populations had increased here, right about here, if you can see my cursor. And then by the 1940s, there was divergence. So in those years, actually, when the Dutch were still around, they started what was called the first kampung improvement efforts, right? So they were concerned because, in the poor kampung where there was stagnant water, there was no water supply, there was no sanitation. These were very in sort of unhealthy conditions, and they posed a risk even to the western sort of quarters of the city for where the sort of the Europeans lived in a way. So this led to their attempts to sort of improve some of the poor kampung in Samarang and Surabaya. So this happened like during this 25-year period, approximately between 15-year period or so, between 1924 and 1939, just before the Second World War. Okay, so what happens after that, right? But interestingly, I just wanted to make a point that although there was this original Dutch created, Dutch initiated slum upgrading, this was actually not known to people in Indonesia. So even in Surabaya, the first planners who decided to do slum upgrading and start the Kampung Improvement Project, they were not aware of this. They discovered this later, actually. So this was not common knowledge that the Dutch had also tried something like this. Yeah. So anyway, so this is interesting. So the Kampung Improvement Project was this slum upgrading project, which in 1969, during 1968, 1969. So this is right after the fall of Sukarno, and then, Suharto comes to power, and then Suharto has a vision of modernizing cities. And so he asked the mayors of a few cities, if I remember right. So these were, I think, Jakarta, Surabaya, I think Medan and Makassar, to come up with master plans to, build the city, right? So Surabaya decides to do this Kampung Improvement Program. So I'll talk about this gentleman called Johan Silas. So Pa Silas was a young architect back then in ITS, and he had just graduated from ITB, and he had come back to work in Surabaya. And he got a chance to meet the then mayor of Surabaya. His name was Colonel Raden Sukoyo, and so he was. So he became very friendly. So he asked some ideas. He didn't know any other planner, at that time. So Pasilas, this young guy, was the only planner. So he suggested something very interesting. This is the important part, right? He suggested that so the common trend back then in the developing world in general, in all the post-colonial sort of states, was they looked at informal settlements and slums as something very undesirable, that it was a blot on the city, that it was something that was humiliating. And so the best thing to do is to remove them and not tolerate them, right? It was a very poor understanding that in general we had. Research was not sufficient, not adequate. And so there was a lot of misunderstanding and misconception about informal settlements and slums. So the general trend was to try to demolish slums, and then if the governments had money, to build like flats and apartments and rehouse them, just like it had been done in like Europe and like other Asian cities before that, in a way, in sort of East Asia, or let's say in much of Europe. So Pasila said something very interesting. He suggested that let's not do this. Let's keep the kampung, because he was inspired by somebody else, who was a big name in this field called John Turner, who had just written these books about informal settlements in Latin America. And he felt that governments actually create a problem. They create more of a mess when they try to provide housing for the poor. Instead, the poor understand their conditions the best, and we should leave it to them. However, that was a very sort of a far-fetched idea for most governments. And so what Surabaya did was they decided, okay, we'll try to do this. And they protected the kampung, and they started providing basic um, sort of investments in kampung areas. So these were very physical interventions like water supply, sanitation, roads, stormwater drainage, and some maybe solid waste management. In the beginning, these were the only interventions. So anyway, so what I'm trying to show is that Jakarta and Surabaya both did this separately in 1969, but the Surabaya model was really more successful, and the World Bank liked it. And consequently, it became a part of, a lot of your national development plans. And gradually, the KIP model became a national program supported by the World Bank and other international organizations. Many others joined in, and the national government also put in a lot of money. So by some estimates, anywhere between 200 cities to 400 cities and towns had been sort of improved with the Kampung Improvement Project. So this was the success of the KIP. That's why it is so famous globally, because it was the scale that it achieved in a way. Okay, so these are some other so this is the timeline to show you that gradually there were other international organizations that also got in. And with time, from the main physical sort of interventions, there was also like environmental interventions and some health interventions that were integrated into the slum upgrading projects, right? So anyway, so this gentleman is Pasilas here. This is an old picture, and um, he continued the KIP program throughout, and it was quite successful. And the reason I have Burisma's photo also here is because she was a student of Pasilas at ITS. And so the reason why Surabaya was able to continue this thing for a very long time is because it became very successful. Pasilas and his team always wanted to work with communities. So they worked with the local RT Airway very closely, worked with the local Kalurahan over years, not just like for like 2 years or something. And this is what helped to continue the program over many years. The success was good. And then most of the mayors, even after the first mayor with whom Pasilas worked, continued the program. So this was the reason why I think it was able to achieve a lot more, because of the understanding between local government as well as the University Research Center. So Pasilas established something called the Laboratorium Perumahan dan Permukiman at ITS. And that became like a research center that did a lot of the spatial planning work as well as a lot of the housing research for the city of Surabaya. Okay, so anyway, so this is the long of it, or the short of it. So what were the successes, right? So in these slides, if you see a green arrow going up, those are like the positives, and any pink, red kind of arrow going down is, in my opinion, what were some of the shortcomings, right? So the early KIP projects, for most of the pre-decentralization era, one of the sort of criticisms was that cost recovery was not good in a way, right? Meaning, if the government, spent so much money, they were not able to recover the money. Now, one very interesting thing has to be noted here. In the Kampung Improvement programs, there was no money ever for housing development. So there was no loans or no subsidies or no money given to actual housing development. So this was a classic example to demonstrate this theory that if informal settlements are provided sort of a security, a sense of security, not even actual tenure, but security of tenure, and you provide some of the basic community level infrastructure, which is difficult for individuals to put, for example, roads, water supply, sanitation, then people will over time be able to invest in their own structures and homes and improve. So this is literally like textbook style development that has happened, right? So anyway, so the extensive upgrading, the costs were generally low, although the cost recovery was also low, but costs were low. These are very simple innovations and interventions, a lot of them through design interventions, right? So for example, the first waste receptacles were these old tires that were used in Surabaya. This is quite a common thing. You see this in many Indonesian cities now, but it was an idea that actually was initiated in Surabaya back in the early 70s, I think, right? And it was also predicated on a lot of community involvement and community support, right? So as you can see, many of you have probably been to these kampungs in different cities, but in Surabaya, most of the kampung were improved, okay? So like in all the kacamatan and kalurahan over like 40 years, pretty much all the sort of kampung had been improved, right? So the housing development happened incrementally. And over time, of course, this led to rising land values, right? So today, if you go to one of these kampungs, it's like become very middle income, very mixed income, and a lot of development is happening. Anyway, now the the influence of Pasilas is very significant because his proteges, his disciples and students who went on to work in the local government also imbibed his philosophy and ethos, and they led to the protection of the kampung. So interestingly, there were no specific rules or regulations that were laid in place. The only thing was said that leave the kampung, aside, don't mess with it and let people do it. Of course, this also promoted your other sort of development sort of approaches like say Musyawara and Gotong Royong and all of those things which were instituted in other kinds of development also. So most of this kampung improvement used community participation and community consensus and decision making a lot, So, but the thing was they protected the kampung. So new kinds of development like big buildings, etc., were only around. Even today, it's like that in Surabaya for the most part, that only on the periphery, on the boundary of like big sort of kampung neighborhoods do you see big development. Inside the kampung, those kinds of things are not allowed. At the same time, the standard like planning and sort of zoning restrictions like setbacks, how much you can build, how much you have to leave, these things, how tall you can build, these things actually don't apply to kampung. So kampung development is initiated through negotiations by the neighbors and working with the RT airway and things like that. So it's a very community-led process. So this is important to understand, right? This is very strong sort of civic engagement and community empowerment in some sense, right? But so because of this, Surabaya is a city which is very interesting that there are very few cities of that size in the developing world. In fact, no other cities that I know of where in the city center you see so many kampung even today, right? Despite having big buildings. So this picture is very close to like Tunjungan Plaza and all, but in the area around it, you still see a lot of kampung. So the red areas in the map that you see are the areas which are the central kampung. These are some of the most poorest areas of Surabaya, all kampung, but they, also did kampung improvement in all these areas, right? Anyway, so the the institutional impact of this was that between the city and the laboratory at ITS, there was a strong relationship that emerged, right? They built up the capacity for local planning and construction, and a lot of community capacity was also built up. And because the results were good, the people were sincere and they tried to do this. Both the local government and sort of Pasilas and his team at ITS, so it built and it was long lasting. These interventions happened, like I said, over 30, 35 years. So it built a lot of trust among the communities. Now, the thing was, at the lowest level, actually, there was still, there were some problems. At some level, the Chamat and the Lura were still not that engaged. And so, like some of these issues with corruption, etc., also existed in Surabaya, which is people associate with the New Order's sort of legacy in a way. And the other problem was because, as you know, in the New Order era, there was very little civil society in Indonesia. NGOs were not tolerated, especially political NGOs and things like that. So because of that, the NGO sector was marginalized. So unlike many other countries in the world where this kind of community-based development in informal settlements usually has a lot of NGO involvement, Surabaya had no NGO involvement. This was very interesting. And also, in the community structures themselves, in the CBOs, like your whatever Yayasan might have existed, or whatever the airway structure was, the representation of women was generally quite low. Okay. Anyway, so the long of it, is that uh, this is an example like from some years ago. So this is a typical kampung, in Surabaya. I think this is in near Kartajaya somewhere, in Juingan actually. And this picture I took at midnight. This is just to show the livability of the kampung. In general, the physical conditions are nice. They are safe. People are there's a sense of community, and public spaces and private spaces, intermix, right? So private actions, happen in public areas. Public actions can happen in somebody's private zones. So it's a very livable atmosphere, right? So this is something which is not just about this kampung, but if you randomly go to any kampung, most kampung in Surabaya, you will see something like this. And this is something unique about Surabaya, right? So anyway, so after uh, I'll move a little quick through this. So after decentralization, this is what I went to study in Indonesia, right? The city government, again, the team at ITS and the city government decided to try something new. So they wanted to do a new kind of upgrading. This was firstly all with local money. So the money was not that much actually, it was less. But most of the focus was going to be on microfinance because they felt that economic development had not really been as successful in the kampung improvement programs because there was no focus on economic development. It's mostly physical and spatial, right? And also some health and education related matters, but not so much on economic development. The problem was that poor people could not really have access to credit. So although there was a big microfinance sector in Indonesia, in fact, one of the oldest and the largest microfinance sectors, it was the government's microfinance sector. So, for example, BRI does microfinance, but even back then, there was a limit. A floor. You could only get more than, let's say, something like 5 million rupiah as a minimum loan, which was a little too much for some people. And they could not really repay it back so quickly. And also, there were challenges to getting official loans because then you needed to show some collateral, some paperwork. So many people could not get this. So the idea was that if you give communities a pot of money and use like a revolving fund mechanism, which is called like the Dana Bergulir, and you allow the communities to decide on their own how they want to loan, what kinds of interest rates they want to charge, how they want to manage, then maybe they will be able to do this better. So one of the main things of the comprehensive KIP improvement project, CKIP, was this microfinance component, right? So anyway, so I'll go through. So it had basically, it's comprehensive but the main thing was economic. It was local and participatory, like I said, completely done with local funds and local monies. And the focus was the empowerment. So they believe that this economic development and management by local communities will lead to more empowerment, right? So anyway, so this was kind of my conceptual framework for my dissertation. So there were three things here. So this I just quickly explained. So this is about opportunity structure. This is about whatever the existing regulatory framework, cultural norms, etc., are in a place. Then these are project specifics, how a project is designed. So these things already happen before you come to the community. And then when you come to the community, you want them to participate. So their level of participation or the modes of participation, how they are designed, depend on the project specifics, but individuals and groups also have agency. So this is a different thing, which is about the participation component. And depending on how this happens, this was my sort of dissertation sort of hook, which was that I said that we must look at empowerment and upgrading outcomes separately. So back then in the early 2000s, there was a lot of talk of empowerment, but there was no clarity on how to measure empowerment. So usually if there was participation in a project, any project, it could be an agriculture project, it could be a health project, it could be, a housing project. If the material outcomes were good in a participatory project, it was assumed that it must have empowered the people. Whereas my argument was that it was not the same thing because the processes that lead to good participation and empowerment are very different. They're slow and they're complicated. You can have a lot of conflicts. Whereas upgrading outcomes after decentralization, this neoliberal policy is to do things very efficiently. So I separated those just as a conceptual framework. Anyway, so the idea was, like I said, in CKIP, there was a lot of microfinance. So they gave these loans, etc., to small. This was nothing new. This already existed in Kampung before that. But now a lot of Kampung small businessmen and entrepreneurs and women could get loans and they figure. And it was not very successful necessarily. Okay. Some were better than others. So for example, CKIP required creating 2 different new CBOs in every Kalurahan. The idea was to separate them from the new order legacy of the Erte Airway and the chamat and lura kind of thing, the structure, which sometimes was kind of co-opted in a way. So they wanted to create new institutions which would be very autonomous in a way, right? And so the ones which were more successful were ones which are actually more women's participation as well as more elites in them, right? Because the process was left to the communities as to how they want to choose their CBOs. So in many cases, the people were like, you know how Javanese culture is, a very deferential. So when you would have a public meeting, people will say, Yapa, you are the best person for this. Why don't you do this? So if anyone was rich or anyone was like a college teacher or a school teacher or, or a professional, they probably were overrepresented sometimes. They also led to good outcomes. I'm not saying that this is elite capture, but it led to a representation of elites more than the grassroots people in a way, the poorest people. And hence it was a little less empowering. Anyway, so overall in CKIP, it was good. It did a lot of good design and physical improvements and all of this, but in this sense here, it was weak in terms of community development. The physical scope was limited because the money was less. Microfinance was not successful very much. And this was because there were no NGOs. In countries like Bangladesh or in India or in Mexico, where microfinance at informal community level was very successful, was because of the very strong involvement and leadership of NGOs. This was missing from Surabaya. And nobody had experience running microfinance, and it's a pretty complicated sort of endeavor to run a microfinance program because you have to have a lot of resources and you have to have constantly also educate people and give them financial discipline and training. So you need a lot of volunteers. And so it was not very easy, just left to the small CBOs in a way. So anyway, that's the overall gist. So this was the CKIP story. Now, at the same time, there were also, after decentralization, a lot of new civil society organizations that were appearing in sort of Surabaya and Indonesia in general. So there were many. So although I said most of the kampung had been improved, there were many small pockets, not huge slums like I showed you in the pictures in Rio or in Caracas, not like that, not even like Jakarta, but there were lots of hidden pockets of squatter settlements and very poor settlements. These were mostly along the rivers, the Kali, in Surabaya, also like along the railway tracks, under the flyovers, things like that. So few as compared to any like Jakarta or something, but still there. These kinds of communities were never really served by the KIP program. This was the mindset of a lot of the policymakers and planners, including, I think, like Pasilas and his team, who felt that these people were not deserving because they were illegal. This is that problem with illegality and informality that is not inclusive, right? So today there is a lot more literature about being inclusive, right to the city and all of this. But even 25 years ago, 20 years ago, this was not something that they knew. And even today it's a challenge, but these were really, so this is actually this is I think in like Bratang in this area. So many of these houses were actually sort of, uh, sort of relocated, demolished in a way, right? So which was not the right thing to do. However, there was, because of the rise of civil society organizations, there was also this grassroots movement that started. So there was this group called the PWS, or the Paguyuban Warga Sren Kali. Okay, so this was a civil society association of squatter communities who did not want to be displaced, and they said that we will work with the city. And they said, we are also like paying tax, we also pay electricity. They didn't have water supply, but we are side of semi-legal in a way. So please also help us upgrade. We will do this. But they negotiated with the city, but long story short, it was not very successful, but they prevented eviction. However, they worked with some other organizations, civil society organizations from like Bangkok and Jakarta, in order to demonstrate to the city that they can do self-upgrading in a way. So they did several houses and they improved like the setback from the river. They created a road so that the fire tender can go in if needed, and they improved the houses. I mean, there was some external funding, donor funding, and also these other civil society organizations. There was a network of like civil society organizations which helped this. But again, this was outside the ambit, outside the jurisdiction of official planning by the city of Surabaya. Okay, so then the third phase starts now, that because Surabaya is still growing and a lot of people are coming to Surabaya from East Java and other places. I mean, as you know, it's a hub for education, right? So a lot of people come from Eastern Indonesia also. So there was a lot of pressure on the surrounding areas, the sort of the different sort of your sort of peri-urban areas, right? So in those areas, they were building these kinds of houses, right? So there were a lot of private actors who were trying to build homes, right? So during Burisma's time, what happened was Burisma decided to not pursue slum upgrading anymore, kampung improvement upgrading, the old style anymore, and instead focus more on building rusunawa, rumah susun sewa, right? Because it was possible. Why was this happening? Because the national government by this time had more money, and Perumnas was actually giving a lot of money to cities. Say, so if the local government could provide land, then they would give the money to build the housing. So after decentralization, when cities are like fighting for resources and it's very hard to develop more resources, they have limited fiscal capacity and all of this, it wasn't very attractive proposition, right? Why would a local government spend more money on doing upgrading and not build Rusunawa if the money is coming from the central government? And like I said, no more big money was coming from the central government for upgrading. So there was a surge in Rusunawa as well as Rusunami. Rusunami fewer, but Rusunami was also middle class mostly. But for the poor people, only Rusunawa. Right. So again, so the first Surabaya only had like a few Rusunawa before this neoliberal phase, maybe about 5 or 6. And they were also done by ITS and Pasilas's groups or designed in a participatory manner with some of the communities. But generally, there were very few Rusunawa, right? So these are some examples of the Rusunawa that were done. This is an example where the the laboratory at ITS was involved and they did patiently like planning and design with these communities, right? So as you can see, these are some examples from, so, but what they did in these communities was that they used their experience and learning from kampung improvement and brought it to the design of the Rusunawa. These are the early Rusunawas, I mean, which they had made in Surabaya. So as you can see, the corridors were very wide. You know, you could keep motorcycles outside. You could have sofas and chairs and tables. And, you know, many of those, I mean, corridors inside the Rusunawa would also feel like a kampung street in a way. And they also were the first ones to provide space for like kakilima and other vendors for the economic part. Mostly public housing flats and apartments don't do this anywhere in the world in a way. So this was kind of a little unique when Surabaya was the first one to try these experiments. So this is another example. This was a community called Sombo in Rusunawa Sombo. And these were mostly like people from Madura who were like relocated. There was a fire in a marketplace or whatever, so they were relocated here. But as you can see, it's about the design thing. There was a lot of attention given to who these people are, what were the trading. So they were trading in like animals and other things. So there was like room made for keeping their stuff on the ground floor, right? And even inside, as you can see, there was a tradition that many of these people worked together and they cooked together, ate together. There's a community lifestyle. So they requested the designers to actually make spaces like this. So this is on the second and third floors. These are like community kitchen areas, community washing areas, not something that you see in traditional Rusunawa or in conventional Rusunawa, right? So anyway, you would also be amazed to see that this was a wedding that was I saw once inside the complex. There was nothing happening outside. There's space outside in the park area and the green space, but the entire wedding ceremony with over 150 people happened on 2 floors of that community. So everyone was involved, right? And of course, there are other like a musola on every floor and some other community facilities. So the idea, like I said, that team brought the kampung improvement, I mean, lessons and the kampung living ideas into this thing, right? So this was during the period when they did some Rusunawa with a very patient community engagement and participatory design process, right? But today you don't see any of that, right? So most of the stuff is like this nowadays, right? With private developers coming in and, even like the government, like the Jatim government, like the provincial government also is building some things, but they are not the same as the kinds of good Rusunawa that were done before, right? So overall, this is my argument that during the kampung improvement phase, I mean, those were very pro-poor policies because of the level of engagement and the level of community involvement and the sensitivity to the needs and things like this, which in a more neoliberal setting, where you have to do projects very quick, you have to get money from the national government, and there's not much more any room for engagement, it's pretty less, right? So anyway, so I'm going to finish in just 3 or 4 slides here. So this was the pre-decentralization. I said it was good because there was such a close coalition that was built between the university and the city. And they were able to do this over a long time. So policy continuity, support from the political leadership, these were all very important things which led to so the unique sort of outcomes that Surabaya had as compared to any other Indonesian city, right? Post decentralization, this problem was the closeness of the city and the laboratory at ITS was also kind of harmful for NGOs and civil society organizations because they did not really use them. They didn't think that they needed them in a way. But the point is that if you really want to scale up activities, especially in a post-decentralization scenario, when you have to do all kinds of development projects, it helps to have NGOs. But the tradition and the legacy was not to have NGOs. And so the mindset was also that they are useless in a way. And of course, there was no regulatory structure for the NGOs and still is kind of fuzzy in Indonesia. So there were lots of unscrupulous and bogus NGOs also in Indonesia which had come up. So generally the sentiment was not very promising, or upbeat about including NGOs, right? So anyway, so this is one of the things. But then as more and more other government projects started coming in and central government money came in for other kinds of things, the emphasis on upgrading kind of died out, right? So today, I think that this city is losing its sort of role in shelter provision. They're doing other things. So now, like for example, during Burisma's later years, one of the policies was that they did not want new industries in the city because they thought that they'll bring in migrants, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of these things that Suyato said at the beginning, right? You need to have more inclusive policies about more civic engagement. So some of those things don't translate into the policies necessarily, right? Because if you don't have industries and economic development, it's going to be difficult. Now, a lot of poor people will be forced to live or sort of work outside or be pushed outside the city in order to access those new jobs, for example, right? So that is an issue. Also, there's not very great transportation, infrastructure. So it puts the burden more. So it seems like you can protect the city by keeping it like it is and not allowing new people to come in or push poor people out. And, so those are not necessarily, in my opinion, like the best policies in a way. So some of these policies were not very good. At the same time, Burisma did a lot of other very good policies, which were about trying to promote economic development, urban farming, solid waste management, local tourism efforts. So these were recognizing the assets of different communities in the kampung and promoting those. But when it came to basic shelter and services, I feel that, some of the gains that had been made in the pre-decentralization and immediate post-reformasi years were kind of getting lost in a way. So anyway, so if you're interested, so I have told the story of Surabaya in this publication, which is and these are available online, which is it's a pretty detailed case study. Just what I told you is kind of condensed and encapsulated in that report. And also, there's this new book we had edited, with Bambang Susantono, who was the leader, the chief of Nusantara until recently. And so this was on how this informal sector has been impacted during the COVID times, basically. Right? I think that's about you. So thank you so much. I went a little bit over, so please pardon that. So I'll stop sharing maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is a fruitful insight, Professor Ashok, from your dissertation ya on Surabaya. Dan mungkin teman-teman sekalian, ini adalah paparan yang menarik karena kondisi yang diangkat adalah kondisi kampung, kampung conditions. Kalau kita lihat dari paparan Prof. Ashok tadi, ya Surabaya dan Jogja mungkin ada beberapa perbedaan, this kind of differences. Tetapi juga ada beberapa persamaan, bagaimana kondisi kampung di Surabaya dan di Jogja. Nah, teman-teman silakan kita ada waktu sekitar 15 minutes untuk bertanya atau memberikan respons tanggapan terhadap paparan Prof. Silakan. Kalau ada yang mau bertanya bahasa Indonesia, saya bantu untuk translation. Nah, Prof. Asuk juga bisa berbahasa Indonesia kok. Jangan jangan sungkan, silakan. Mungkin tadi ada yang belum clear atau bagaimana, silakan. Oke, silakan Pipit.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. I was wondering about this is from what I see. Urban planning often prioritizes formal development and large-scale economic interests, frequently overlooking the contribution of informal workers was a stand critical aspect of city life. Then how can cities realistically reconcile the rights and needs of informal workers such as home-based workers, street vendors, and waste pickers with the pressure of rapid urbanization and the demands of formal business and private developers? Thank you so much.
Okay, maybe we
Should I
answer
answer this or
Profesor
you like one
Sak.
more
Okay.
question?
Oh, one more questions. Okay. Silakan tadi Ismail Hasan.
Ya, izin izin bertanya ya Pak. Jadi tadi saya tentang yang Bapak sampaikan itu, saya ingin bertanya Pak, kan kita lagi di Kota Jogja bakal ada pemilihan kepala daerah, itu wali kota. Nah, dalam wali kota itu beberapa menjadikan akan ada kesetaraan terhadap pendidikan, layanan kesehatan dan fasilitas umum. Yang ingin saya tanyakan adalah bagaimana pemerintah kota menjamin akses yang setara terhadap pendidikan, layanan kesehatan dan fasilitas umum lainnya. Sudah sekian, terima kasih.
Oke, baik. So Prof Ashok, Ismail as.
Ya, it was not very clear. Tidak terlalu
Okay,
jelas ya tadi. So,
baik. So the first question we will answer, Prof Ashok,
yeah, but
from
you can,
Fikri.
what was Ismail's question? If they're similar, then I can integrate maybe.
Oke, Ismail's question is sebentar lagi kita akan have election ya, election in local government, mayor, the city mayor in Yogyakarta and in Surabaya, and then simultan election, Prof. Ashok, simultan election in Indonesia. So how we can assure, how we can guarantee that the new formally local government uh, will provide more inclusive access to education, sanitation, and microfinance credits like that. Your more like your recommendation to the newly formed government in 2025 in local elections.
Okay. So thank you so much. Yeah. So, thank you for the question, Fitri Anaya. And Ismail. So let me explain. So the reason I said Surabaya is a great example is because even without even without specific policies to help people in the informal sector, specific policies, right? Just by protecting the kampung and preserving the kampung, they were able. So because in a kampung, there are all kinds of people, right? So you have some very rich people, some, like upper middle class, a lot of students, young professionals, like number of koskosan is increasing in most of them, but also provide shelter to the poorest people. So in many of in the centrally located kampung in Surabaya, you'll find that some of the, like the pemulung, waste pickers, some of the, like pedagang kaki lima, they all live in these kampung, right? There was not any specific policy for them, but just by providing them access to shelter in centrally located areas, it did a lot of help and service to that category. Now, over time, of course, they've tried to do some things. And some of those things, the formalization is not necessarily always very successful. For example, let's say there were also these, like, so Burisma, I think, tried to also do, and many other cities are doing this in Indonesia, like in the Singapore style of providing like these hawker centers, right? So all the sort of the food vendors, now they are being organized into like centra culinaire, right? But that is really limited. You can only have so many number of, traders. And so what I'm saying is it should still allow more of the informal activities to sort of go on in a way, right? Now, the question is, how do you reconcile these two realities? One of the main problems is that the education of planners needs to change. So that's another thing that I've been involved in the last few years, about transforming sort of, or trying to push urban planning pedagogy and sort of curriculum in a different direction. So we are working with, like, say, our partners in Undip and other places to do some of this, because like I said, all these theories about inclusivity, about right to the city, about political empowerment, many of these theories actually come from other social sciences disciplines. Whereas planning education in Indonesia is still very sort of technocratic and very technical, and so they work on like spatial planning, designs, model projections, economic models, GIS and all these things. But the social and cultural nuances of theories, I mean, although they read about it maybe a little bit in planning theory, but it's not really seriously imbibed, in my opinion. So that's a mismatch. So now, interestingly, in ITS, for example, what I told you, so Pasilas was an architect, and that laboratory is not in a planning department, it's in an architecture department. So a lot of it happened because of individuals, their leadership, right? And like I said, the people who followed, a lot of his students who went on to work in the local government, they really admired Pasilas and his philosophy, and they tried to apply it, right? But in a standard planning classroom or in a standard planning curriculum, there is not much emphasis even now on understanding this. So what happens is the bureaucrats who work, and they can be from other disciplines also, right? So let's say, I mean, it's not only like planners or social scientists who work as in the planning departments, right? So they would be coming from like geology, and they'll coming from like civil engineering, and those fields have very little connection to any of these theoretical progressive ideas in a way, right? So this is where I think a lot of the, I mean, long-term change has to come from, and significant substantial change has to come through change in education. However, in practice also you can change. But the question is, how will you change in practice? Who are the institutional players who can understand the needs of the informal sector people and the poor people, right? So many of the public agencies and their officials don't understand this necessarily, and because they have so many other things to do, they are very busy, they're underpaid, overworked, right? So they don't have the time to go and really engage at the grassroots, right? Private sector interests have very little interest in doing any of this because it's not profitable in a way. So that leaves the third sector, or the civil society sector. So this is why I was saying that the role of non-profit organizations, your LSM, and other kinds of, sort of civil society organizations and foundations and associations. And a lot of these things are appearing now in Indonesia. We're doing some research on understanding the landscape of civil society in Indonesia and different islands. And it's very revealing, that it's very encouraging that a lot of young people are creating new kinds of civil society organizations. They are sometimes short-lived. They have some challenges about funding, but they are changing the discourse. So the answer is, in order to, again, so both your answers, a greater role has to be played by civil society and civil society organizations. So what governments can do, local governments also, and regional governments and the national government, is actually to promote more civil society organizations. When you promote more civil society organizations and make it competitive among civil society organizations, then you'll see a lot of innovation. Good ideas will stand out. They will rise to the top like that, right? But it has to be there. Right now, there is no structure to actually, so, I mean, like I said, at the beginning of after decentralization, there was no really regulatory structure to regulate or support nonprofit organizations. Then somewhere around, after about 8-10 years, there was a new law that came in, which actually provided tax breaks to nonprofit organizations. But that is as much support as there is in Indonesia for this. Mostly in countries where you have very robust civil society sectors and a lot of robust NGOs and a big population of NGOs, the governments actually provide funding to NGOs and civil society organizations. So that is also like a mandate of the government to actually do that, because a strong civil society sector also acts as a counterbalance, right? It checks, sort of what the state does. It checks what the private sector does. It's like a watchdog. It's also like an intermediary. It's a glue. It can bring different stakeholders together. And those organizations are the ones, the civil society organizations are the ones who know the conditions on the ground the best, because they work with communities. Now, one could say that in Indonesia, traditionally, because you've worked with RT, RW and all those neighborhood organizations, yes, they are also good, but their sort of information capacity is limited. Whereas civil society organizations are usually started by people who are motivated, they are, like they're educated in certain areas, they have certain visions, they have networks. So this is the difference. So my suggestion is to sort of help the civil society organizations to grow. So even common people like you and me can be part of civil society campaigns that start locally to have more civil society engagement. So for example, if there is a project, a sanitation project, if there is a education project, any other project, you can engage. I mean, the design should be, so far, mostly in Indonesia, a participatory program means that the government agency is going to work with the community directly. So they'll have like a, like a local, like a yayasan or something at the community level, or like a kelompok swadaya masyarakat, like a self-help group, and they'll work directly with the government. But what I'm saying is there should be more room for civil society organizations like NGOs, etc., also to work in this. It builds the capacity of the NGOs and also helps the organizations. So even for the new government and whatever is saying, I think that's the one. And they only by working like that will a lot of public bureaucrats and officials or government officials understand that it's okay to have informality, that you should be inclusive of migrants, you should be inclusive of the poor people, sort of shutting them out, not allowing them the benefits and welfare benefits that they should be getting is not necessarily a wise thing to do, you know. So because they cannot go back to school and learn all this, they cannot go back to university, the way they can learn is by actually working with organizations and institutions who do this in a way. So sorry, that's a long answer, but yeah.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Ashok, for the insight. Second termin, maybe in 5 minutes, silakan ada yang memberikan tanggapan atau pertanyaan. Banyak hal yang bisa kita pelajari dari temuan Prof. Ashok, diterapkan di Jogja mungkin. Problem-problem, silakan teman-teman mahasiswa atau teman-teman umum. Kota ini full dengan problem. Mungkin ada yang ingin mengambil tema-tema PKM or scientific research-nya tentang isu-isu perkotaan, silakan. Mumpung eh, kita kehadiran Prof. Ashok ini bisa memberikan insight, silakan. Oke, maybe sambil menunggu Prof. Ashok, we see that between Surabaya and Yogyakarta, there is a common ground. I'm sorry, it's in the matter of how they deal with the prostitution area. Yeah,
Yeah.
in Yogyakarta we have Pasar Kembang, and then in Surabaya we have a prostitution area called Doli that already raised, ya, sudah
There
digusur
was,
oleh
not
Bu
anymore.
Risma, ya. Oh ya,
Yeah.
sudah menghilang. And in your opinion, Prof. Ashok, how the best way to deal with such such a area that we know that informality works in prostitution area, right? That there is a connectivity between the security apparatus and the local boss such the mafia and mungkin dengan pengelola rumah bordil, the bordilers, and how the best deal suggestion that you can give to us gitu ya sebagai political students or political scientists to
Yeah.
deal with such phenomenon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. Thank you. So
Hmm.
that is another action that I was critical of in Surabaya, action by
Yeah.
Burisma. Why? Because, see, the thing is, prostitution is one of the oldest professions, in human society, right? It's not going to go away, right? So the thing is, in my opinion, I think sex work should be legalized and legitimized. You can restrict it to certain areas. That is possible, right? So, for example, let's say like what happened with Dolly, right? So the reason it happened was because I believe I was told the story that, one day when the mayor went there and was talking to went to a school and some child was not able to answer some basic questions and asked like why, and said that because the mother was, I mean, not, I mean, could not sleep the whole night or something, and she couldn't sleep or whatever. So then the next action was to completely shut down Dolly, right? So did it end the thing? Actually, it was very problematic because after for several years, and then shortly after that, after a few years, then the pandemic also hit, right? So Dolly had a huge, let's Pasar Kembang also like has a huge economy, right? As a micro economy of so many different, I mean, things who serve. So yes, I mean, culturally and socially, that I mean, livelihood, that sort of act may not be, I mean, liked by a lot of people. They might have moral reasons to oppose that or whatever. But if you look at it from a pragmatic sense, banning it doesn't really create a solution. So, for instance, there are some states in India which have banned alcohol, right? But you can find alcohol even more, I mean, in those places. It's more expensive, it's underground, and it's very dangerous sometimes, right? Because a lot of people die from spurious alcohol that is made. So, what I'm saying is that outright banning doesn't help. You look at drugs, for example, right? Many soft drugs. The US is a classic example where so many things are banned, but it's rampant and it's like creates gangs and trafficking and all of this problem. So when it comes to, again, coming back to prostitution, I think a place like Dolly was actually, it was visible, and people were there, it did not actually have that much trafficking,
Yes.
like not the cities. But when you ended that, what happened? They did not change. All those sex workers, they went to different places, right? They went to Bali, they went to Sulawesi, and then they started operating over social media and WhatsApp, right? Now that is invisible, and that actually exposes the sex workers, and mostly women and young women, to much more risk and danger in a way, right? So the other example is, let's say, Thailand, for example, right, where most of its foreign exchange actually comes from the tourism industry, a large part of which is the adult tourism industry, right? So officially, it is banned in Thailand, right? Officially, it's
Yeah.
illegal, but because it's tolerated, so a lot of, again, NGOs and civil society organizations can work with them directly, right? Which helps. So that is why sort of HIV/AIDS training and sort of that awareness is very high in the huge sort of sector, sex work sector, even in Thailand, in like in the big cities and all, right? So in my opinion, it should not be banned, but it should be regulated. You can spatially restrict it. So you can say that sex work is not allowed in X area or Y area or something like that, right? And in some of the more progressive countries and cities, actually, it is very legal, right? In a way. So again, I mean, I don't think Asian societies are yet there where you can make it totally sort of, I mean, legal and like completely formalize it, but you should at least allow it. And that will provide better opportunities to monitor it and also provide them the help. Again, here, this is where it is, again, I'm saying having a strong civil society presence, having lots of civil society organizations to help you do this is very important. So whether it be housing or services or, I mean, sex work, I think, again, I think if you want good governance and you want effective governance in cities, given how complicated and challenging, I mean, today's problems are, all three sectors have to work together: the state, market, and civil society. And in order to enable those other sectors, the state has a big role to play to incentivize the civil society sector, to incentivize the private sector to work together, I think. So that's basically the gist of my answer.
Okay,
Can you?
thank you for your insight, Professor Ashok. Maybe ada lagi students? If it's not, we would like to thank you, Prof. Ashokdas, for your fruitful insight once again. And then we would like to thank Professor Suyato for the attendance and the opening remarks. Represent Department of Civics Education and Law. And then we would like to thanks to DSG, Development Study Club, represented by Mas Reza Hikam as the founder that organize this uh, discussion ya by webinar and tidak lupa juga to all of the participants, especially students from political science batch 2024 from Yogyakarta State University. We hope that Professor Ashok maybe one of our students or maybe all of our students can reach their pursue their dream to next master degree in University of Hawaii. And concerning in political and urban issues, maybe if you are if you allow us, maybe we could correspondence by email, Prof. Ashok. Maybe if there is one of our students that want to discuss or maybe share his or her thought to you, is it okay, Prof. Ashok?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, I have my email address on that, you
okay,
guys have it. So yeah, please, yeah, I'll be more than happy to guide and help in any way. Yeah.
okay. We really appreciate your warm welcome, Prof. Ashok. And
Thank
once
you so
again, I
much for
say thank
inviting
you.
me. Yeah,
Thank you,
yeah,
thank you, thank you so much. That's all, Bapak dan Ibu, Mas-mas dan Mbak sekalian. Terima kasih sekali lagi, Prof. Ashok. Good afternoon, selamat siang, selamat melanjutkan aktivitas. Kalau ada waktu ke Yogyakarta atau ke Indonesia, ke Surabaya, Prof. Ashok
yeah.
berkenan untuk hadir di sini.
Inshallah. Ya.
Siap. Terima kasih, Prof.
Terima
Ashok. Terima
kasih
kasih.
banyak.